Welcome to lesson number 4. In this lesson, we'll be painting this waterfall, which cuts through the jungle and runs down a cliff into the pool below. Please make sure you've watched the lesson 4 warm-up so that you're familiar with the reference material required for this lesson. Here's the lesson 4 example painting, which we'll be using as a guide, and in this piece we'll be using several image hose nozzles to construct this piece. For example, the distant trees were accomplished with a brush that makes clumps of green foliage. The foreground leaves were painted using a leaf knife. I've already loaded this image into the reference palette, so we can go ahead and start painting. Let's create a new canvas by going to File and New. And this time we're going to choose the portrait orientation, so we want it to be 14 tall by 11 wide. You want to make sure you set your resolution first to 150. Let's go ahead and create a sketch. We'll create a new layer for the sketch. We'll make it a multiply composite method. And we can start sketching in roughly where we think we want things to be. So I'm going to do a green with a detail oils brush. And this will be the top tree line that'll kind of come down in a sharp V. And then I'll use blue for the waterfall that will kind of come out and then go straight down to maybe about here. There'll be some splash there and some mist. And then I'll change to a different green. There's going to be some leaves in this general area here in the foreground. I'll use a orange for the area where there's going to be moss, so that'll be kind of around here. Maybe even kind of color that in part way so that we remember to do moss in just that area. And then everything else will be pretty big trees. There's going to be a patch over here where the rock shows through. So I'm just doing some little rough indications of where I think I want things. And I'll turn down the opacity of that sketch layer a little bit, and we can go ahead and start defining the main layers here. Let's go ahead and start with the background cliffs since they're one of the most distant objects. We'll create a new layer, put it below the sketch, and we'll call it cliffs. We'll use a gray color for this, and we'll use the mountain knife. You want to use a pretty big knife, and you want to paint with the edge of the brush as you would when you're doing a mountain. So I'm going to roughly follow the sketch here. I'm not going to worry about doing it exactly because this brush kind of does what it wants, and that's the good thing about it. It gives you that nice rugged edge. And then we'll fill in a little bit of the bottom here. You want to keep some of that varied opacity on that edge there. That looks nice. So fill it in a little bit like that. And then along the bottom, you can go ahead and just fill it in. This bottom is just going to blend in to the water, so you don't really have to worry about it too much. And then we can fill in the middle with the scratchboard tool, since that's just faster. Something like that will work. I'm going to make sure the center is nice and opaque. And then if you need to, you can always go back with the mountain knife again and paint over it a little bit more to make it a more seamless transition. Like so. We're keeping this kind of gray for now because we're going to use the glazing method to put color over it. Now let's go ahead and blend this bottom edge so it's not so sharp. We use the diffuse blur blender. I'm going to use a pretty big brush and just use winding clockwise strokes, very tight clockwise strokes, and firm pressure. And you can just blend in the direction of the curve back and forth lightly to really smooth it out. This is going to be covered by a lot of mist, so you won't really be able to see the bottom edge very well. And I probably created some white fringe. Can't see it because it's on white, so what we're going to do is we're going to turn on preserve transparency. We're going to use the scratchboard tool with this gray color to paint over the whole bottom area here to make sure that we get any white fringe that was caused by blending. So that's just painting gray over it. Then we can turn off preserve transparency, and we'll add a layer below the cliffs for the pool of water. We'll call it pool. And we'll fill this with darker gray. We can just use the scratchboard tool for that. Make sure you paint all the way up behind the cliffs layer here. We just need to just fill in this area. Let's create a layer below the pool, and we'll call it sky. And this we can fill with a light gray, just using the scratchboard tool. Make sure that you cover all of your mountain edge here. And now we can go ahead and start painting in the waterfall. Let's add a layer above the cliff for a waterfall. And for this we will use one of the image hose nozzles. It will be the Break Thick nozzle. And we will use the Paint Break image hose brush. We'll choose a very light gray color for our secondary color. We'll have to click on the secondary color first, and pick a light gray, and we'll paint in a waterfall. We'll use a smaller brush near the top, and we want the waterfall to kind of come out and then go straight down, and you want it to break. So you want to try to just use a few long strokes like this to let it build up. That way the edge is nice and textured. And it can go down to about here. We won't include the splash in this yet. We want the center to be pretty filled in, but the edges can be kind of sharp. Let's turn on Preserve Transparency, and we'll add some highlights using white. And you want most of your highlights near the top. I'm trying to make sure that this again breaks, so I'm using these long, quick strokes. Let's turn off Preserve Transparency. We'll add a new layer for the splash. And we'll use the same brush for that, and the same colors as we used for the waterfall. So I'm going to sample the gray color first. I'm going to use upward short taps to make it look like it's kind of spraying. I'm going to turn on Preserve Transparency for that splash layer, and I'm going to select white, and I'm going to add some highlights like so. If you're having trouble seeing, you can always hide your sketch layer so that you can see it a little bit better. Then we want to blend the bottom edge of the splash into the water a little bit, so we'll use the diffuse blur brush. We'll turn off Preserve Transparency, and we'll use kind of firm circular pressure to blend this in. Keep the top edge sharp, but let the bottom edge kind of blend in smoothly, and it'll look more real. And then we can blend this a little bit to give it some movement. We'll use a slightly bigger brush, and we'll use very light pressure and blend in the direction that the splash is going. That makes it look like it's moving. And we can do the same with the waterfall too. We use very light vertical strokes to just pull that water straight down. If you want to try to separate the waterfall from the splash a little bit, you can give it some shadow. You can turn on Preserve Transparency and select a primary color here, this gray for your main color, and use the digital airbrush. Then I'll just put in a little bit of a shadow. Let's use a slightly darker gray. A little bit of a shadow there that separates the waterfall from the splash. If you do too much, you can always blend some of it using the coarse oily blender. You can just blend straight down to push that shadow down out of the way a little bit. I think that looks better. Let's add a layer below the waterfall for spray. This will be the bigger layer of mist that's being caused here by the waterfall. We'll use a light gray and the jitter airbrush to paint in some mist here. And we'll have to turn off Preserve Transparency. And I'll fill in only to about here, so I'm going to draw this area in first. And I want the mist to be thicker right where the water is crashing. So this is going to be the area I fill in the most. And I'm going to use lighter pressure so that I kind of taper this off and the mist is less thick, kind of fades. I want it to kind of fade up into the edge of the cliffs a little bit. You want a nice even transition like this. The bottom edge of this we want to be pretty sharp. If you go too heavy with this mist, what you can do is you can use a mask. So we'll create a mask on the spray layer, and then you can paint with black into that mask using the same brush if you want to, and you can reduce some of that mist a little bit and make it a little more transparent. That can be good to do sometimes to help it fade out more naturally. If you do too much, you can switch to white, and then you can bring the mask back. The center of this area we will highlight with white, so let's go out of our mask back to the layer, so make sure you click on the icon that's to the left of the mask to select that. And we'll use white, and we will use the digital airbrush to just highlight this area here and make it a little bit more white. And then we'll want to blend this a little bit with the diffuse blur brush, so we'll use a slightly bigger brush. We'll apply our layer mask too by right-clicking on it and going to apply layer mask. And now we can go ahead and blend. We'll use kind of lighter pressure to blend this at first. A little bit everywhere, and then towards the edges we'll use firm pressure to really fade it into the background. And then we'll use the coarse oily blender on the bottom edge of this to make it look more rippled. You might want to play with your paper texture and set it to something kind of like this. That way you'll get more of a smudge. I'm just kind of scrubbing back and forth and following the contour of the water here. And then I'm going to use the diffuse blur again just to blend the edge so it doesn't stand out so much. You just want this edge to be nice and sharp and rippled. Now, since we have a few different layers for our waterfall, let's go ahead and group those. We'll group the splash, the waterfall, and the spray. I'll just call it waterfall. Let's do some work on the sky now. We'll go to the sky layer, and we'll go ahead and fill it with a daylight color. So we'll switch to the scratchboard tool, and we'll pick a very light blue, something like this. We can try, that might be too indigo. I like this here. This is the kind of blue that I want. And we don't need to give too much detail to the sky because not much of it is showing. So all I'm going to do is just add a slightly darker area at the top and a slightly lighter area at the bottom. So I'm using a digital airbrush with a pretty big brush. I'm just going to lightly put a little indigo at the top, sample my original blue, make it lighter, put in some of that. I'll add a little bit of cream near the horizon, but not much. And that's really all we need to do to our sky. You can blend it a little bit if you want.